The woman's voice on the 911 line is calm, almost bored, as she says she thinks someone is standing in her kitchen. The dispatcher tells her to leave the house immediately. She pauses, then whispers something that makes the entire call go silent. "He's already in the room with me." If stories like this pull you in, if real emergency calls that went terribly wrong keep you listening to the very last second, then make sure you subscribe now, because the calls you're about to hear only get darker from here. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. on a quiet weekday night, the kind of shift most dispatchers remember as slow and uneventful. The woman on the line identified herself as Laura Bennett. She said she lived alone in a small rental house on the edge of town. At first, she sounded annoyed more than scared. She told the dispatcher she didn't want to waste anyone's time, but she kept hearing footsteps in her house. The dispatcher asked if she had checked on the noise. Laura said yes. She said the back door was locked, the windows were locked, and nothing looked disturbed. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was there. The dispatcher asked her to go to a safe room and lock the door. Laura laughed quietly and said she felt silly doing that. She mentioned that she had just moved in 2 weeks earlier and wasn't used to the house yet. As the dispatcher continued asking routine questions, Laura suddenly stopped talking. When the dispatcher asked if she was still there, Laura whispered that she could hear breathing that wasn't hers. The audio recording captures a faint sound in the background. At first it sounds like air moving through a vent. Then it becomes clearer. Slow, steady breathing. The dispatcher immediately told Laura to leave the house if she could. Laura said she couldn't. She said her bedroom door was stuck, like something heavy was leaning against it from the other side. Her breathing became shallow. She said she could see a shadow under the door, moving back and forth. The dispatcher stayed on the line, telling her help was on the way, asking her to stay quiet. Then Laura said something that changed the tone of the call completely. She said she remembered something the landlord told her during the walkthrough. There used to be a second bedroom, but it was sealed off years ago after a fire. The dispatcher asked where the sealed room was. Laura said it shared a wall with her bedroom. The breathing on the recording grew louder, closer to the phone. Laura said she could hear scratching now, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. Police arrived at the house 7 minutes after the call began. They found the front door locked and no signs of forced entry. Laura did not respond when they knocked. They forced their way into the bedroom and found Laura hiding in her closet, unharmed but in shock. The bedroom door showed deep gouge marks on the outside, as if something had tried to pry it open. When officers investigated the sealed room, they discovered a narrow crawlspace that led into the walls of the house. Inside, they found bedding, food wrappers, and audio recordings saved on an old phone. Every recording was taken at night. Every recording captured Laura moving around her house, unaware she was being watched. The 911 call came in at exactly 2:17 a.m., a time when most nights blend together for emergency dispatchers. The woman on the line spoke clearly at first, almost casually, as if she were apologizing for calling. Her name was Laura Bennett. She explained that she lived alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of town and that she kept hearing noises she couldn't explain. She said it sounded like footsteps, slow and careful, moving from room to room. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. She sounded like someone trying to convince herself that she was overreacting. The dispatcher asked Laura if anyone else lived with her. Laura said no. She had moved in just 2 weeks earlier after a breakup and was still getting used to the house. The dispatcher asked if she had checked the doors and windows. Laura said she already had. Everything was locked. Nothing appeared damaged or disturbed. She even joked nervously that maybe the house was just settling. Still, she said the footsteps didn't sound like wood creaking. They sounded deliberate, like someone walking barefoot on a hard floor. The dispatcher suggested Laura go to a room where she felt safest and stay on the line. Laura hesitated. She said she didn't want to bother the police over nothing. But as she spoke, her voice lowered. She said the noise had stopped, and somehow that scared her more. Silence, she explained, felt worse than the footsteps. Suddenly, Laura stopped mid-sentence. The dispatcher asked if she was still there. Laura whispered yes. She said she could hear breathing. Not her own. It was slow, steady, and coming from somewhere close. The audio recording captures a faint sound in the background, barely noticeable at first. As the seconds pass, the breathing becomes clearer, closer to the phone. The dispatcher's tone changed immediately. She told Laura to leave the house if she could do so safely. Laura said she couldn't. She had retreated into her bedroom, but when she tried to shut the door, it wouldn't close all the way. She pushed harder, and that's when she realized something heavy was pressed against it from the other side. Laura's breathing became fast and shallow. She whispered that she could see a shadow beneath the door. It moved slowly from left to right, then stopped. The dispatcher instructed her to stay quiet and told her officers were on the way. Laura nodded even though the dispatcher couldn't see her. She said she didn't understand how anyone could be inside. There were no signs of a break-in. Then Laura remembered something that made her voice tremble. During the move-in walkthrough, the landlord had mentioned that the house used to have an extra bedroom. Years ago, there had been a small fire, and instead of rebuilding the damaged room, it was sealed off completely. Laura had laughed it off at the time, assuming it was just an old renovation story. The dispatcher asked where that sealed room was located. Laura swallowed hard before answering. She said it shared a wall with her bedroom. At that moment, the sound on the call changed. The breathing grew louder, no longer muffled. Laura whispered that she could hear scratching now, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. She pressed herself into the corner of the room, clutching her phone with both hands. The dispatcher told her help was less than 5 minutes away and begged her to stay as still and quiet as possible. The scratching stopped abruptly. Laura whispered that the pressure against the door was gone. Before she could feel any relief, the door handle began to move. It didn't rattle violently. It turned slowly, carefully, as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to make noise. Laura started to cry, covering her mouth to keep from screaming. She said she could hear someone whispering her name. The dispatcher asked if she recognized the voice. Laura shook her head. She said it sounded close, too close, like someone leaning down to speak through the crack beneath the door. Then the line went quiet. The dispatcher repeatedly called Laura's name, asking her to respond. After several seconds, Laura whispered back. She said the door had stopped moving. She took the chance to run into her closet and shut the door behind her. The dispatcher stayed with her, counting her breaths, reminding her she wasn't alone. Police arrived at the house 7 minutes after the call began. They announced themselves and knocked loudly. There was no response. Concerned for Laura's safety, they forced entry. The house was silent. As officers moved down the hallway, they noticed deep gouge marks carved into the outside of Laura's bedroom door, as if something sharp had been used to try to pry it open. They found Laura curled up inside her closet, shaking but unharmed. She could barely speak. Officers escorted her outside while others searched the house. At first, they found nothing unusual. No broken locks, no forced entry, no one hiding in the obvious places. Then one officer noticed a section of wall behind Laura's bedroom that sounded hollow when tapped. Further inspection revealed a hidden crawlspace leading into the sealed-off room. Inside, officers discovered makeshift bedding, empty food containers, and a pile of personal items that clearly didn't belong to Laura. The most disturbing discovery was an old phone found inside the crawlspace. It contained dozens of audio recordings, all taken late at night. Every recording captured sounds from inside the house. Laura moving around. Laura talking on the phone. Laura sleeping. She had never known she was being listened to. Whoever had been living in the walls vanished before police could identify them. Laura never returned to the house. To this day, she says the worst part isn't knowing someone was watching her. It's knowing they were close enough to whisper her name through the door, and almost close enough to open it. The second call is one of the most replayed and debated 911 recordings in recent years. It came from a teenage boy named Marcus Hill. He was 16 and home alone while his parents worked an overnight shift. The call begins with Marcus speaking quickly, his voice cracking as he tries to explain that someone is knocking on his bedroom window. The dispatcher asked which floor he was on. Marcus said he was on the second floor. The dispatcher told him not to open the window and asked if he could see anyone outside. Marcus said no, but the knocking kept moving. First the left side of the window. Then the right. Then directly in the center, slow and deliberate. The dispatcher told Marcus to stay on the phone and move to a different room if possible. Marcus said he couldn't. His bedroom door was locked, and he was afraid to open it. Then the knocking stopped. For several seconds, there was silence except for Marcus's breathing. Then the sound changed. Instead of knocking, there was scraping, like something being dragged across the glass. Marcus began to cry. He said he could see words forming on the fogged window. The dispatcher asked him to read what it said. Marcus hesitated, then whispered that it said "Let me in." Police were dispatched immediately. As officers were en route, Marcus said he heard a voice outside the window. It sounded like his mother. She was calling his name, telling him everything was fine and to open the window. The dispatcher told Marcus not to listen, to stay where he was. Marcus said it sounded exactly like her, even using the nickname she always called him. The audio captures a woman's voice in the background, calm and convincing. Marcus started to move toward the window before the dispatcher shouted his name and told him to stop. Marcus froze. He said something was wrong. His mother would never be home at that hour. When officers arrived, they found no one outside the house. There were no footprints, no ladder, no signs of tampering. But the window showed faint handprints, smeared across the glass from the outside. Inside Marcus's room, officers found something else. The fogged message was still visible, etched permanently into the glass. As if burned there. The second 911 call came in just after midnight, a time when neighborhoods are usually quiet and the smallest sounds feel louder than they should. The caller was a 16-year-old boy named Marcus Hill. His voice was shaking, but he was trying hard to stay calm. He told the dispatcher that someone was knocking on his bedroom window. At first, he assumed it was a prank, but the longer it continued, the more afraid he became. The dispatcher asked Marcus what floor his bedroom was on. Marcus said the second floor. There was a pause on the line, followed by the dispatcher asking him to repeat himself. Marcus did. He said there was no balcony, no tree close enough to reach the window, and no fire escape. Still, the knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was outside wasn't in any hurry. The dispatcher told Marcus not to open the window under any circumstances and asked if he could see anyone outside. Marcus said he couldn't. The streetlight outside his house only illuminated part of the yard, leaving the area near his window swallowed by darkness. He said the knocking moved. First it came from the left side of the glass, then the right, then directly in the center, each knock spaced evenly apart. Marcus locked his bedroom door even though no one else was home. His parents were working an overnight shift at the hospital, and he was used to being alone. This felt different. The dispatcher told him to stay on the phone and move to a safer area of the room. Marcus backed away from the window, his voice dropping to a whisper. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. The dispatcher asked if he could still hear anything. Marcus said no. He took a breath and said maybe whoever it was had left. That's when the sound changed. Instead of knocking, there was a slow scraping noise, like something being dragged across the glass. Marcus gasped. He said it sounded like fingernails. The dispatcher told him to stay where he was and asked him to describe what he could see. Marcus said the window was starting to fog from the cold outside air meeting the warmth of his room. As the fog thickened, something appeared on the glass. Lines formed slowly, deliberately, as if written by an invisible hand. Marcus stared, unable to move. The dispatcher asked him what was happening. Marcus swallowed hard before answering. He said there were words on the window. The dispatcher asked him to read them. Marcus hesitated. His voice broke when he whispered the words. "Let me in." Police were dispatched immediately. The dispatcher told Marcus that officers were on their way and instructed him to stay locked in his room. Marcus nodded silently. Then he said he could hear someone talking outside the window. At first, the voice was faint. Then it became clearer. It was a woman's voice, calm and familiar. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He said it sounded like his mother. She was calling his name softly, telling him everything was okay, telling him to open the window so she could come inside. The dispatcher's tone became urgent. She told Marcus not to listen and reminded him that his parents were still at work. Marcus said the voice knew things only his mother would know. It used a nickname she had called him since he was a child. It mentioned his dog, who had died years earlier. It sounded patient, loving, and real. Marcus stood up without realizing he was moving. He took a step toward the window. The dispatcher raised her voice, calling his name over and over, telling him to stop. Marcus froze. He said something felt wrong. His mother would never ask him to open a window in the middle of the night. The voice outside grew frustrated. The calm tone slipped, just slightly. Marcus said it sounded closer now, as if the speaker's mouth was right against the glass. The dispatcher stayed with him, talking constantly, refusing to leave him alone with the voice. When police arrived minutes later, the voice outside stopped abruptly. Officers searched the yard, the roofline, and the surrounding area. There was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the soil. No ladder. No marks on the siding. Inside Marcus's room, officers noticed something that made the case even more disturbing. The message on the window was still there. The fog had faded, but the words remained etched into the glass, as if burned or scratched from the outside. Let me in. Marcus's parents arrived home shortly after and were told what had happened. They insisted no one else could have known the details the voice used. The dispatcher confirmed that the woman's voice had been audible on the recording, clear enough that it couldn't be dismissed as Marcus's imagination. Investigators were never able to explain how someone could reach a second-floor window without leaving any evidence. No suspects were ever identified. Marcus refused to sleep in his bedroom again. His family eventually moved. Years later, Marcus said the scariest part wasn't the knocking or the words on the glass. It was how badly he wanted to believe the voice was his mother, and how close he came to opening the window. The final call is the shortest and the most disturbing. It came from a man named Daniel Cross, a rideshare driver working late on New Year's Eve. He called 911 from his car while parked on a residential street. He told the dispatcher he thought his last passenger was still in the back seat. The dispatcher asked if he could see anyone. Daniel said no. He said the ride had ended 10 minutes earlier. The passenger was a quiet woman who never spoke, never moved, just stared straight ahead. Daniel said he watched her get out of the car and walk into a house. But now, his car felt heavy again, like someone was sitting behind him. The dispatcher told Daniel to exit the vehicle and move to a safe distance. Daniel said he couldn't bring himself to turn around. He said the air in the car felt cold, and he could hear fabric shifting behind him, like someone adjusting their seat. Then the dispatcher heard it too. A faint clicking sound, like a seatbelt being pulled. Daniel started to panic. He said the seatbelt light had just turned on. He said the back door locks clicked shut on their own. Daniel begged the dispatcher to stay with him. He said the rearview mirror was moving, adjusting itself. When he finally glanced up, he screamed. He said the woman was sitting there again, smiling wider than any human should be able to smile. The call ended abruptly. Police found Daniel's car running with the driver's door wide open. There were no signs of a struggle. The back seat was empty. But the seatbelt was buckled. Daniel Cross was never found. The third 911 call happened on New Year's Eve, a night when emergency lines are already busy with noise complaints, drunk drivers, and fireworks mistaken for gunshots. That's why the dispatcher almost missed how strange this call truly was. The man on the line identified himself as Daniel Cross. He was a rideshare driver working the late shift, trying to finish one last ride before midnight. Daniel's voice sounded tense but controlled. He said he was parked on a quiet residential street, engine running, hazard lights on. The dispatcher asked why he had called. Daniel hesitated before answering. He said he believed his last passenger was still inside his car. The dispatcher asked him to explain. Daniel said he had picked up a woman earlier that night. She never spoke, never looked at him through the mirror, and never moved the entire ride. He assumed she was tired or upset and didn't push for conversation. When they reached the destination, she exited the car without a word and walked toward a dark house at the end of the street. The ride ended normally in the app. 10 minutes later, as Daniel prepared to leave, he felt the car shift slightly, as if weight had settled into the back seat. At first, he blamed his imagination. But then the temperature inside the car dropped. His breath became visible, even though the heater was running. The dispatcher asked Daniel if he could turn around and check the back seat. Daniel said he couldn't. He said something about the space behind him felt wrong, like it was occupied even though he couldn't see anyone. The dispatcher instructed him to exit the vehicle and move to a safe distance. Daniel said his hands wouldn't leave the steering wheel. He said he could hear fabric moving behind him, the soft sound of clothing brushing against leather seats. As the dispatcher stayed on the line, a faint clicking noise was picked up on the audio. Daniel inhaled sharply. He said the rear seatbelt had just been pulled. A moment later, the seatbelt warning light illuminated on the dashboard. Daniel began to panic. He said the back doors locked on their own. He pulled at the driver's door handle, but it wouldn't open. The dispatcher told him to stay calm and keep trying. Daniel said the rearview mirror was moving, slowly adjusting its angle. The dispatcher asked him what he could see. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he didn't want to look, but the mirror kept moving until it forced his eyes upward. When he finally focused, he screamed. Daniel said the woman was sitting there again, exactly as she had been during the ride. Her head was tilted slightly to one side. Her eyes were wide and unblinking. Her mouth stretched into a smile that didn't look human, as if it extended farther than her face should allow. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She just stared directly at him through the mirror. The dispatcher tried to keep Daniel talking, telling him help was on the way. Daniel said the woman's mouth was moving now, silently forming words. He said he could hear her breathing, even though the car was silent. The cold intensified, creeping into his hands and chest. Then Daniel said something that made the dispatcher pause. He said he didn't think the woman had ever left the car. He said he couldn't remember the sound of the door opening or closing when the ride ended. He said he just remembered looking up and the back seat being empty, like his mind had skipped over something important. The dispatcher heard a low sound through the phone, like a soft laugh or exhale. Daniel began to sob. He begged the dispatcher not to hang up. He said the woman was reaching forward now, her hands stretching toward the front seats. He said her fingers bent in ways fingers shouldn't bend. The dispatcher told Daniel to close his eyes and keep talking. She told him officers were less than 2 minutes away. Daniel's breathing became erratic. He said the seatbelt light was flashing now. He said the mirror cracked suddenly, splitting the woman's reflection into fragments. The line filled with a loud static sound. Daniel shouted one last time, begging for help. Then the call ended. Police arrived moments later. They found Daniel's car idling in the street with the driver's door wide open. The headlights were on. The back doors were locked. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage to the interior. The back seat was empty. However, officers noticed the rear seatbelt was buckled, pulled tight as if restraining someone. The seat cushion was indented, still warm to the touch despite the freezing air inside the vehicle. Daniel Cross was never found. His phone was recovered on the driver's seat, the call log still open to 911. Investigators ruled out foul play due to lack of evidence, but no explanation was ever given for the locked doors, the buckled seatbelt, or the sudden disappearance of the driver.